Will I hit record? Okay, so the recording is in progress, and the plan is to post it on YouTube afterwards. So welcome everyone to the Governance 101 virtual teach-in. It's a collaboration between Queen's University and Concordia University. As many of the attendees and speakers today are tuning in from each of these campuses, we would like to begin by acknowledging that both university campuses are located on unceded Indigenous lands where many Indigenous communities continue to be present and rooted in today. Living, learning, teaching, caring, and working at Concordia University takes place in Gachage or settler Montreal, which is the unceded traditional Indigenous lands of the Kanakhaga Mohawk Nation and is known as a gathering place for many First Nations. We recognize Kanakhaga as custodians of the land and waters on which many of us gather today, and understand that their stewardship is a model for how we must collectively respect our natural environment and community as a whole. Living, learning, teaching, and working at Queen's University takes place in Cataraqui or settler Kingston, which is the unceded and traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Anishinaabe peoples. This territory is part of a long history of relations between Indigenous nations before European colonization, namely the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant between Anishinaabe Nation and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This living treaty outlines the reciprocal responsibilities for caring for shared territory while peacefully respecting each nation as separate and sovereign, ancestral wisdom that we should all learn from. We acknowledge that for those of us who are settlers and non-Indigenous people, our knowledge of these lands' history is limited and has been corrupted by colonial state powers, which continue to build and maintain the influential post-secondary institutions that many of us benefit from today. As teachers, learners, workers, and community members of these universities, we play a role in either maintaining or disrupting colonial structures of governance that organize our respective institutions. And it's our duty and responsibility to use our positions of power, privilege, and platforms to actively work towards decolonizing post-secondary education institutions located in and on Turtle Island, which includes decolonizing our syllabus, our classrooms, our communications with each other and the broader community, our pedagogy, and our ways of thinking and knowing, as well as committing to anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-imperial intention and action in all that we do. Uprooting the pervasiveness of colonial cultures within our universities requires radical changes in the hierarchical structures of governance in our universities' disciplinary systems and norms, in our employee relationships, in financial, budgetary, and leadership practices, which all sustain ongoing settler colonialism. We ask that we all keep this in mind as we discuss university governance in the following teach-in. This teach-in is a co-production of Queen's Coalition Against Austerity and a group of concerned faculty and students from Concordia University. It's clear that we've been facing a lot of the same issues: budget crises, austerity measures, and a strong feeling that we need to get better at using the governance mechanisms that are available to us. Universities are not and should not be governed the same as businesses or some other large institutions, and yet many of us who work or study in universities don't understand how our schools are structured, how decisions get made, and how we can participate in shaping or changing them. We decided that a short educational session on university governance might be useful, and we are excited to welcome our wonderful speakers to help us learn some more. Our first speaker today is Dr. Peter McInnis, who is a professor in the Department of History at St. Francis Xavier University. He researches and teaches North American labor and working class history, the Cold War era, and 1960s and 70s social history. McInnis has been active in faculty unions for over 20 years, including St. FX Faculty Association president with the Association of Nova Scotia University Teachers. He has served on the executive committee for the Canadian Association of University Teachers since 2014, including 4 years as chair of the Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee, and will complete a second term as CAUT president in this April. We asked Peter to come and give us some sense of the broader context, and he's going to speak on counteracting the mismanaged university, why collegial governance is vital for the future of Canadian education. And this presentation will analyze efforts to support collegial governance in Canadian universities and discuss a range of challenges in this principle and contemporary experience. Anna Sheftel is principal and associate professor at the School of Community and Public Affairs at Concordia University, and she is an oral historian by training, working on memory of genocide, migration, and activism. And Stephen Yeager is chair and professor of English at Concordia University, who researches Old and Middle English literature and its relationship to institutional memory. And Stephen will talk to us about basic university hierarchies and governance structures. And Dan Cohen is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University, and he is an economic geographer who studies marketization, public finance, and education policy. Dan is going to give us an introduction to university budgets and how we can understand them. So we thank all of the speakers who joined us here today, as well as all of the attendees, and we will go ahead and get started with our first speaker.
Thanks, Claire. And thanks as well for those who've organized this teach-in at Queen's and Concordia. And it's not surprising that both Ontario and Quebec are facing acute crises in post-secondary education. You will know, those in Ontario, that Jill Dunlop, the Minister of Universities and Colleges, announced about 10 days ago that the province is going to supply about half of what their blue ribbon panel suggested for funding. And I know the Concordia, and joining with McGill, is especially responding to the attacks by the Legault government on essentially accessibility to the university. So those external attacks are something that we'll have to deal with in a university environment. But what we see this is a kind of crisis opportunity of administrators and consultants and others to change the fundamental nature of governance. As an historian, I have to go back and note that almost 60 years ago, the Duff-Berdahl Report on University Government, as it was called, this was a joint inquiry by CUT and the precursor of Universities Canada. And in this 1966 report, they made some comments that sound amazingly contemporary, and I'll quote briefly. Commissioners are clearly disturbed by what they saw as the efforts of a too rigid hierarchical structure, a failure to obtain in the advice of the people most concerned with the effects of decisions to be taken, and sometimes even the failure to communicate these decisions, leading to frustration, misunderstanding, resentment, and a conviction of waste. Therefore, there must be a vastly improved degree of consultation, and this would include the selection of presidents, vice presidents, deans, and department chairs. Well, there you have it, almost 60 years ago, the situation we're still feeling today. Also noted here is the year before that, CUT commissioned a report called Tenure in Canadian Universities. This was prepared by Daniel Silberman, faculty of law at Queen's University, and he points out the importance of tenure, linking what he called university government. So our contemporary situation is obviously quite analogous. And I know that as part of this, the ongoing teachings, you've had a presentation from Okufa and Michael Savage talking about consultants. I would not repeat what he is saying, other than to note one of the consultants often used is Deloitte. And Deloitte Canada released a report recently called Higher Education, and they always have an ominous subtitle, As a Business Model Changes, Governance Model Must Change Too. So this report, like many others, is suggesting streamlining the governance structures and essentially cutting out what they would refer to as stakeholders, not that we were ever consulted, so faculty, students, and staff. So if you look at these reports, I think part of the response is to see how shallow they are. They're really importing American examples, or as Queens would know, from Nous, Australian examples that aren't applicable. But if you actually look at the analysis, it's very, very thin. There's a sources cited, a kind of bibliography. Many of the publications they're listing are 10 years or more out of date. So as Savage reported from the Akufa survey, this is recycled stuff. So part of it is pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. These consultants really don't have a lot of gravitas, but they're given more credence than they often are. So I know that Queens is going through the Queens Renew. This is, again, not a new initiative. University of Saskatchewan had what was called Transform Us, US for University of Saskatchewan, and it was resisted fairly effectively by their faculty and students and staff as well. So what I'm encouraging is resistance. So how do we go about this? So as you know from consultants and other reports, whether they're internally or externally produced, most of these are just redistributing received thinking and a prescribed solution. So consultants, for example, will write what the university senior administrators want. And most of them ride roughshod over collegial governance and academic freedom. So let me turn to some CUT policies. So we have a policy statement on governance. These are all available on our website. And this provides a succinct definition. And it says essentially, academic staff must play the decisive role in making academic decisions in order for post-secondary educations to fulfill their responsibilities. It also highlights the role of academic staff associations in this process. Efforts to diminish or bypass faculty participation in academic decisions undermine the institutional mission statements. So we're looking at, obviously, we're familiar with department level, collegial governance, faculties. The main formal body, of course, is Senate, or the equivalent in Alberta is called the General Faculty Council. In Quebec, it has a slightly different name, and the Board of Governors, which tends to have a nominal participation of students and faculty. But all of these had latent power. And so the examples in the past, Dalhousie University is one, where faculty had caucuses before Senate meetings. I mean, part of the onus on us, if we want to have a larger role in governance, we have to be prepared to assume that role, not just as a negative role, but also to prescribe more constructive solutions. So too often, our members of Senate, I've been on Senate several times at my university, and my colleagues show up and they read their Twitter accounts or they read their email. One used to read a long novel, maybe it was Jane Austen or something, but they weren't engaged in the process. And if they're on Board of Governors, they thought that they represented the city-state of themselves, and to refuse to report a response to their fiduciary duty to their colleagues. So this imposition of a omerta of silence has been tried at a number of universities. Carleton was one. So there was also a survey conducted by CUT about 5 years ago, looking at governance structures of Board of Governors, and there's no uniform model. It varies quite a bit. In the case of Queens, it'd be the Queens Charter, working off of that. But really what you see is a recently developed misinformation campaign led by people like Cheryl Foy, if you ever come across her name, Foy, or Peter McInnis, who's written 2 tomes on this, often distributed at Board of Governors. And they're saying that staff, student, and faculty are in conflict of interest for actually responding to what's going on. They're supposed to observe and really have a very nominal participation. So you've got to work against that clearly. I'm also suggesting, as you have done with this coalition, not only working through formal bodies, but informal bodies. I would also mention financial literacy, and that's something that is going to be addressed very shortly. But don't look at budgets. I've sat on budget committees for a number of years. Budgets are aspirational. They don't really tell you what you want. You need to look at financial statements, audited statements, and also gain a more financial literacy in the not-for-profit organizations sector. So collegiality should not be confused with civility or imposed definitions of successful comportment of congeniality. The bar for this is fairly high in this country in terms of congenial behavior. We don't have to agree. And CAUT says, because governance is not about agreeing, we can agree to disagree, and we can do so in a way that's effectively. So what I've said before as well, we need to supply concrete positive solutions. So in the imposition, and I'm most familiar with Queen's situation, not a little less so with Concordia, the responsibility-based budget, performance-based budgeting. I mean, these models have been imposed in many cases from the United States or the UK or Australia, and they've been disastrous. So we need to, again, call this stuff out. But we also need to put more onus on the expectation of all of us to be engaged in service. And too often that's been underplayed. We need to actually show up and play a larger role. So the CAUT has a governance committee, and we have a governance toolkit coming forth pretty short. So these are, useful resources for you. But also we need to, as I said, think about coalitions of the whole, bargaining for the common good, and also looking at not only the formal bodies, as I said, Senate and Board of Governors, but develop a constructive alternative critique. So there is a way out of this, and the catastrophizing that I know that both Concordia and Queens have been facing is something that we can overcome. It's part of a larger national trend. And I think we should draw on our provincial and national bodies as well to help us with all of those things. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We will move on to our second presenters, and I realized that I didn't introduce myself. My name is Claire, and I'm a student at Queen's University.
Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. Thank you, Peter, for that presentation, which is very informative. And thanks to our colleagues at Queen's and at Concordia for working with us in this first step towards building the kind of solidarity across Canada that Peter was talking about. Our goal with this section of the teach-in is just to summarize some of the basic structures that Peter went over in his overview, how universities work, and to explain what professors mean when we complain about things like administrative bloat and academic freedom. We've based our summary on a simplified description of our own university, Concordia, though the basic structures we're outlining and the conflicts that they create are similar to what you have at Queen's, and which are common in a lot of the universities that Peter listed and elsewhere.
So we want to start with the key value of the modern university that is a source of a lot of debate these days, which is academic freedom. The main point of the job security that comes with tenure is supposed to be that it creates equality between researchers so that their disagreements about the value of a given research topic should have as little impact as possible on whether that topic is pursued. This is academic freedom. The more tenured faculty at a university, the more it is able to foster an environment of academic freedom. But also the more difficult it becomes to govern. So there's an old joke that illustrates the principle: only in an academic department is a vote of 20-1 a tie. The principle that universities try to use to herd the cats that are its professors is called collective self-governance. While it is more difficult for a democratic assembly of individuals to work together and find common ground than it is to just appoint someone to make all the decisions for everybody, the complexity of the university is actually one of its strengths. How else can we teach our thousands of very different students with these very different origins and aspirations, not only what their previous researchers have discovered, but also how to think for themselves? And the whole point of the university structure is supposed to be in service to governing ourselves collegially and democratically, academics governing academics.
The main administrative unit that brings faculty together and students together is the department, which governs academic programs. When you get a degree from a university, whether graduate or undergraduate, it's because you completed at least one program that was designed and administered by a department. Most departments have more than one program, and some programs can even span departments. So Concordia English has its own major, but we also have a joint specialization with history that we and the history department oversee together. Every department is governed by a chair or a principal or other unit head who isn't so much a boss of the department as they are a member who is responsible for a designated period of time for communicating the needs and wishes of the department collective to the senior admin, and also for sharing messages from the senior admin with the department. Departments also have their own dedicated staff who are typically not academics by training, but who nonetheless know the programs very well, and so make vital contributions to the academic mission. And so this then is the structure of the department within which faculty and students exercise their academic freedom, pursuing their research and their programs.
And so many arguments about academic freedom are about the division of labor in the university between the academic sector of faculty departments and programs and the other offices that sort of any employer of our size would have. Such offices include things like human resources, facilities management, and so on. All of these offices serve important functions that serve the academic mission, but they aren't supposed to oversee academic decision-making. The researchers, instructors, and departmental support staff that actually deliver university programs are supposed to be in charge of those programs. But the lines can get blurred, and that can lead to the problem that gets called administrative overreach.
So let's go with our example of facilities management. What should the physical space of a classroom look like? The best answers to that question would be found by a conversation between the teachers designing courses, the departments who know how those courses fit into their programs, and the professionals who know what spaces the university has access to and what resources are available for fitting those spaces out. So administrative overreach in this example would be for facilities managers to simply design the classrooms themselves without really considering the impact of the decision on instructor working conditions, pedagogical visions, and so on.
The structure that's supposed to prevent administrative overreach in most universities is a bicameral model of governance that can be thought of as representing the academic and the other offices sort of split. And Peter mentioned this a little bit earlier. The Board of Governors is responsible for establishing the legal and administrative framework for the university. There are student, staff, and faculty representatives on Concordia's Board of Governors, but they are outnumbered by external members who are often CEOs, political leaders, consultants, and other high-profile professionals. The Senate, meanwhile, is the highest body in the university on the matter of academics, and it is made up mostly of faculty and students, as opposed to the Board of Governors. So in theory, the Senate's equal status to the Board of Governors is supposed to help prevent administrative overreach and ensure collegial self-governance. But in practice, the Senate is usually just a rubber stamp. Because by the time Senate's approval of a decision is sought, the financial decision's already been made. And without a say in budget matters, the Senate is not really a check against the power of the Board of Governors.
Among the Board of Governors' main responsibilities is appointing a university president, who in turn appoints a university provost. The Board of Governors is essentially the president's boss. Most university leaders today use a metaphor to publicly traded corporations to describe the structure. The Board of Governors is like a board of directors, the president is like a chief executive officer, and the provost is like a chief operating officer. So this means that the president makes managerial decisions and defines the agenda of the university as it is seen by the outside world, while the provost oversees the day-to-day administrative and operating decisions. Presidents and provosts are typically tenured academics, and technically the provost of Concordia is the highest ranked member of the academic side of the university. At least that's my understanding of the title, vice president academic. But the president and provost are exempt from the faculty union. They don't typically teach and often haven't taught in a while. They are paid much higher salaries than other faculty, and they oversee many non-academic offices. So for example, at Concordia, the provost oversees the Ombuds Office, the Equity Office, and the Center for Teaching and Learning, all of which interface with academic faculty, staff, and students, but which are not academic units.
Both the president and the provost's office also have large offices charged with overseeing different portfolios. So again, at Concordia, there are vice presidents of research, advancement, services and sustainability, and integrated planning. There are also a number of deputy and vice provosts. At Concordia, there's a vice provost of innovation and teaching and learning, of faculty development and inclusion, and several others. And I'll note that 2 new positions were created in the last 6 months alone at Concordia, vice provost of enrollment and student experience, and vice provost of, I can remember, vice president of professional education and valorisation du français.
These positions fall into what is at the very least a gray area of administrative overreach. So like the president and the provost, vice presidents and vice provosts are generally academic researchers themselves, though similarly, they've often left a lot of their old jobs behind. Less ambiguously, presidents and provost offices also have many staff and leaders and advisors who are professional administrators, and so who are not supposed to be charged with making academic decisions, though again, their decisions quite commonly have academic implications. And this is further complicated by the fact that increasingly, as Peter laid out for us, universities also rely on external consultants who come into this organization ambiguously. They have a hefty price tag and they take on special projects, which can short-circuit decision making. External consultants, of course, have much less of a stake in the university itself, and that's why they're generally considered a problem.
It's important to note further that the complaint about administrative bloat, where more and more resources are concentrated in administrative rather than academic hiring, usually refers specifically to administrative staff like the folks who work in the president's and provost offices, and not the staff in departments. So I think by our last count, the provost office at Concordia has about 60 staff members. Again, departmental support staff are important members of departments who are vital to the administration of programs, who provide frontline service to students. And there is generally not a problem of administrative bloat at the departmental level because we're almost universally understaffed. Presidential and provostial staff, on the other hand, sometimes perform services and make decisions that could be performed or made by academic faculty.
Underneath the provosts are the deans of the various faculties with a capital F, which is to say an administrative group of aligned departments. At Concordia, there's the very big Faculty of Arts and Sciences, there's the John Molson School of Business, the Gina Cody Faculty of Engineering, and the Faculty of Fine Arts. And each of these faculties has a dean who is to the faculty what the provost is to the university. And so the problems of administrative bloat we just described are often repeated in the problem of multiplying associate deans and decanal staff. There is then quite a large apparatus of university governance above and around the departments that oversee and deliver programs.
So this is, of course, an oversimplification of even Concordia's governance structures. And as a point of reference, our colleagues at Queen's have provided this really helpful and more detailed look of how governance works at Queen's. Obviously, we can't speak to how governance works at Queen's, but if you have any questions about the differences between our two models, you can raise them in discussion. But as you can see, many of the basic principles are the same. Queen's just has even a little bit extra.
So to summarize then, there are two main things that professors complain about when they complain about university governance. The first is administrative overreach, where decisions about academic programs and delivery tend to get made at the top by outside consultants, teams of academics and non-academics who are relatively distant from the day-to-day of delivering academic programs. Meanwhile, department faculty and staff are consulted after the fact about decisions that are already made as they spend more and more of their time writing longer and longer reports to request fewer and fewer available resources. And so to come back to the question in the title of this teach-in as a whole, who has power over what? The answer is that universities are meant to be collectively governed, but in practice, they are increasingly top-down and non-transparent, despite their seemingly democratic structures. Second, one of the reasons that there are fewer resources for departments is administrative bloat, as the folks making the decisions that academic faculty ought to make tend also to cost a lot of money. When universities find themselves in a budget crunch, the obvious thing for them to do would be to cut back on administrative costs, maybe hire fewer consultants, try to protect the departments and programs, not only because of the university's primary mission, but because students pay the tuition that is such an important source of revenue, and so the obvious way out of the hole. Instead, academic programs and departments tend to be the first to get cut while administrative offices continue to grow. And it just as one final point, picking up a bit on what Peter said, we want to emphasize that we think it's unproductive to personalize these issues. At Concordia, our deans and associate deans, provosts and vice provosts, senior staff, are all dedicated professionals who we believe want the best for the university and its students. Our concern is with how these structures, which are meant to be democratic, actually create these problems and divisions between people who share these goals. Everyone at our universities need to work collegially and in spite of differences to come up with new and better ways of organizing ourselves that can protect academic freedom and our mission while also being fiscally responsible, and so help us to navigate this difficult moment for higher education as a whole. And we hope that this teach-in helps all of us move towards that goal. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you both very much. And now we'll move on to Dan.
Everyone, can I get a thumbs up if you all can see the slides? Perfect, thank you. So building on that, in order to have these type of collegial discussions, we need to understand, and this is something Peter will emphasize, financial literacy, understand how the money flows within the university and how it works. So that's where I come into this teaching. And I also want to say it's a pleasure to be speaking virtually at Concordia. I did my postdoc with you all with Norma Rantisi, who I see is in the participants. So I know now. So I want to start off by saying I'm not an accountant. I don't have an accounting degree. The background of this work is coming from what I've learned as a member and then chair of the Queen's University Faculty Association Budget and Finance Committee, as well as some excellent resources that, if I can advance my slides, I'll show you, that are available from CAUT and OCUFA about how we can look at and understand university finances. And I've pulled a lot of that information out into this presentation, and you can see the link to the CAUT guide. So I wanted to start off with that question. Peter teed it up actually quite nicely about thinking about what budgets are. And it's important when you hear these like big scary numbers that get reported at the beginning of the year of, at Queen's a $62.8 million deficit, to realize that that is a projection that the university is doing about what will happen next year. It is not a realized figure of what has actually come to pass or necessarily what will come to pass. And this makes budgets very political, because budgets are making a claim on what's going to happen in the future. And embedded in that claim are a number of subjective accounting decisions about what revenue will come in, how much expenses will be, as well as assumptions about that information. And so I really want to echo Peter, and this is something that I'll do in this presentation, is that it's often more productive to look at audited financial statements that are reported at the end of the year that say this is what actually happened, this is what revenues actually came in, this is what expenses were, and crucially, this is how the university managed that to cascade money that did come in throughout the university. And that's where it comes to kind of thinking about what are the decisions being made, and in the spirit of collegial governance, can we talk about these decisions? Can we think about them and talk about them through these the infrastructure that is supposed to govern the university? Throughout this presentation, I'm going to give some examples of what we've done at Queen's that has kind of used this type of thinking. The first was, quite simply, some folks at Queen's looked at the difference between what the university projected was going to happen at the beginning of the year in the operating budget, and then what actually happened at the end of the year when you looked at the audited financial statements. And so you'll see in the column for this, right, we found quite a significant difference there. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. And it is very important for communications to say, hey, this is what budgets are. And so we need to interrogate their assumptions and think about what decisions are being built into them. One example that was found at Queen's was an assumption being built into the budget that Queen's largest non-endowment investment fund produces quite a bit of investment income, but there was a decision within the budget to limit the amount of that income that could be used for operations, the day-to-day running of the university, the departments, and all those things that Ann and Stephen talked about, to only $5.2 million of that investment income would go to fund the operations of the university. That fund is currently worth $613 million, so 5.2 million of that is 0.85% return. I think you don't need a finance degree to know that's quite a little bit, quite a small return. And so this is a decision the university is making. We're only going to use $5.2 million of this investment income into our budget. This leads to kind of a larger budget deficit than if that were to be used otherwise. And so we can debate whether that should be used otherwise, but we can't do that until we interrogate the assumptions that are built into a budget and have a discussion about that. I do want to build on other aspects that have come out from, I think, what Peter was saying. When we think about it's an important question to understand where the money comes from for the operating budget of the university. Where do the funds come from? At Queen's, if you look at where the money comes from the operating budget, 58.4% of operating revenues come from student fees and 31.8% from grants and contracts. And so these are largely based on either what the province sets tuition at or what provincial funding comes in place. So the big driver of the revenues that come in is the provincial government in Ontario. And this is quite similar at Concordia, where 34.6% of operating revenues come from tuition fees and 52.6% come from grants. You'll notice that these are switched, the relative ratio. Ontario, there's much more focus on tuition versus provincial grants. And so here we can see just how much provincial policy decisions make a difference. And that's what Concordia is experiencing right now with the kind of changes in policy at the provincial level. So it's always important to say, when we're fighting for just higher education, we're fighting for public funding of that just higher education, which builds the context within which these budgetary pressures that are being felt at our universities exist within. At the same time, there are decisions that universities make about how to handle these budgetary pressures. And so I want to break a little bit into how we can, some of the terminology that is used in budgets that can really help us understand what's going on. And one key terminology that's often used when budgets are discussed or when you're reading reports is the difference between unrestricted and restricted funds. Unrestricted funds are relatively simple to understand. That's the money that comes into the university, often through tuition and grants, that can be used for any purpose. Restricted funds are broken up into two parts. There's what are generally called internally restricted funds, which are funds that the university has that they've said we are going to allocate for things like capital or for specific research centers. And so they've said we are restricting the use of those funds for those specific reasons. And then there are externally restricted funds, which are funds that often come from donors or specific grants that those who are giving the money have said it can only be used for this purpose. So when universities talk about restricted versus unrestricted funds, as CUFA mentions in the report, this can often be misleading because some of that money is internally restricted, which means that administrations have made that decision to allocate it to capital versus everyday operations. And so it's important to understand restricted, unrestricted funds so we can understand what money the university has available for operations, but also understand that difference between internally restricted and unrestricted when we're talking about the university's fund. And so for an example that we've seen here at Queen's, the university has made quite clear that they view a lot of the internally restricted funds as off limits, and they've talked specifically about capital reserves, saying we've allocated that's internally restricted, we can't use it to manage budgetary pressures. However, as we've put more pressure on through our collegial governance, such as Senate, to find out more about what's happening at the university's finances, the university published how they've allocated capital reserves, and there's $40 million there that they report is sitting there uncommitted. So what's that decision to make it restricted? Can we have a discussion about that through our collegial governance systems? We don't know that until we understand the finances and how money is moving through the university. And that's why I agree with Peter that it's so important to do that. In terms of another important thing to keep an eye out for as you're looking through university budgets, is understanding that all universities break up their funds in their budgets into separate buckets, separate funds that are allocated for specific purposes. So when you look at the end of year financial statement, you'll see the operating and general fund, which is like the main fund that's used for university of operations. A lot of tuition fees go into there. They pay the salaries and benefits of the people who run the university. But then you'll also see a number of smaller funds, such as research funds, where a lot of grants for research go into, ancillary funds, which is where kind of residences and parking sit, the capital fund, where money goes to fund new buildings and maintenance, and the endowment fund, which is where a lot of donations are held. Why that's important is because, as CUFA mentions, any transfer between these funds, they say, reveal the intention of the administration and how to use the resources of the administration of the university. So we want to pay attention to how money comes out of the operating fund, which funds the day-to-day operations, into other funds such as capital or ancillary or so on. That movement allows us to see a little bit about what the university is prioritizing, and it can be a huge driver of surpluses and deficits. So right now, York University, when you look at their headline figure, it's quite a large deficit. They're building a new campus. So in the long run, maybe that increases their revenues and they're allocating capital towards that area. So I don't want to suggest that all interfund transfers are important. That is how we maintain our buildings. That is how we put money into, still having the facilities we need, but we can still look at what money is being transferred for and ask these questions if we're thinking about collegial governance. So if looking again at some of the things that have popped up at Queen's University last year, it was reported there was a $15 million deficit. Once people started looking a little bit under the hood, it was noticed that there was a $30 million transfer to the capital fund that was not planned ahead of time. That was used to kind of repay an internal loan. It was a kind of an accounting decision, but it led to the deficit looking much larger. And now Queens is reporting that in public as more of a $20 million deficit. We've also seen, through pushing through this kind of collegial governance, that all that investment income over $5.2 million from the pooled investment fund, we now know that that's all directly transferred to capital reserves. And so again, we can have a discussion about, in a moment of budgetary crisis, is that the best use of capital? Could we be using it to preserve our academic mission? Maybe we really need that money for capital reserves, but we don't know that this is being done, and we can't discuss it without this type of financial literacy. And that's the type of thing that it's really important to pay attention to when thinking about university finances. Peter also mentioned this, and I can't really talk in detail about this because it's so different across universities, but within the operating budget, so not these interfund transfers, how money is distributed into the different faculties, within faculties and departments, depends greatly on the budget model. So some universities use an incremental model where you generally get the same amount of money every year. Other universities like Queen's have this kind of activity-based model where it's based on certain metrics that the university puts in place, such as bums and seats or that sort of thing. And there's also differences between university based on how much money the kind of central administration keeps, and then their decisions on how to use that central money to fund different activities across the university. So this can vary greatly from school to school, but the most important thing to understand here is that these decisions impact where budgetary pressures are felt, right? So these are not neutral models of how money is used, but instead can drive which faculties are winners and losers, which departments are winners and losers. And so again, here, transparency in how money is distributed even within the operational fund is vitally crucial, and we really need to have information about how the university's budget models work. So this is something we're still kind of struggling over at CUFA. Finally, just to give a bit of an update of what's been happening at Queen's. So like I said, the beginning of the year, the projected budget deficit was $62.8 million. Now we're down to $40.7 million. So that's 22.1 million less. These are from the latest projections provided by the university. There's all sorts of reasons for that. The university is saying the hiring freeze has been more successful than they projected, and there's been a kind of reduction of costs. One thing that they previously did not report on, but due to the kind of pressure through collegial systems, I guess they've decided to add, is now we can see that investment income actually reported at the end of the year in a kind of second line they've added to their financial reports. And so you see, if they were including the full amount of that investment income, the projected deficit would fall further to $18.6 million. As far as we know now, they're still suggesting that they will use that extra $22.1 million to put into capital reserves. But at least now we know that that's being done, and we know how much money that is. And again, can talk about it through collegial governance if we protect those systems. And that's why it's important to have both collegial governance and financial transparency. So yeah, that's what I wanted to kind of give that little 101 on how we can think about different parts of the budget and why if we are to have collegial governance, we need to know, we need to follow the money essentially. So that's all for me.
Great, thank you, Dan, and the rest of the speakers. We're now going to move into a question and answer period. So feel free to raise your hand to use the video and audio function, or you can also use the chat function, or you can send myself or Mary Louise Adams a message directly, and we will ask your question. Eleanor?
Thank you very much, and thank you for those presentations. They were all highly informative. I'm wondering if there is a straightforward way when it comes to some of the decisions that are being made to find out what falls within the purview of the administration and what falls within the purview of the faculty. And I'm thinking specifically here about some decisions that are happening within the Faculty of Arts and Science at Queen's. And how would we know what's the responsibility of the dean and how much license she has to make decisions, for example, about, I don't know, transferring seats to other student numbers to other faculties, or would that, and that's just a hypothetical because there's others as well. But how do we know what is faculty boards and what belongs to the dean?
I'll jump in for that. I mean, I think that this is, my own understanding is that these things are never set in stone. They're constantly evolving. One dean will do it one way, another dean will do it another way. That if you have a question, then, you know, then the appropriate thing to do is to ask. And I understand that usually the venue for asking those questions would be academic senate, would be, this would be exactly the sort of thing that, you know, what sort of decisions are the deans in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences making and what are their implications? You know, your department chair could ask one-on-one, or alternatively, if it seems to be a broader structural thing, then you could go through Senate. I don't think that, and everyone else please jump in and correct me if you have a different understanding, but I think that, you know, unless these things are specifically laid out in some sort of collective agreement or something that you can see, then probably it's you know, contingent based on what works for the people who are working on it at the time.
There may be faculty complement to language in collective agreement. I think that part of it is many faculty haven't read their collective agreement and don't ask for help on those issues and on just generally organizing. So I would agree with Stephen's point that these aren't set in stone. The so-called leadership team needs to be queried about some of the applications of the in the case of Ontario, the strategic mandate agreements, SMAs, or those types of things. But these are all political and they impact our teaching and learning experience. And so I urged in the earlier point about a campus united strategy. So not isolating faculty from unionized staff, but also especially a role for students. In the case of Queen's, the EMS, students are very influential in this, and if they can be confident in articulating in an effective way their disagreement with some of the things that are going on. I mean, this should have happened probably 10 years ago in the case of responsibly-based budgeting, because that's a disaster. But I don't think we can fall to this kind of shock doctrine. So as I said, university as a sector has been underfunded for a very long time. And it comes to nobody's surprise that Ontario is the worst, 31%. So we have publicly assisted education. We don't even have publicly funded education, but there's a limit to our tuition. There's a limit to what families can contribute to education, but this is part of a social determinant of health. And so if students get engaged because their careers are affected in the long-term trajectory and indeed their physical and mental health, this is something they really need to struggle with. And I think that they can join faculty and not do this separately. So for too often, faculty unions have been trying to go this alone to the extent that they even wanted to do it. But now this is something that I think everybody can find a common cause. So that's what I mean by bargaining for the common good, not necessarily officially in a collective agreement, but that's another way of doing it, but just trying to coordinate. And I think this teaching is a good strategy.
I just
you.
want to jump in with one more little comment because I see lots of questions, which is, yeah, I mean, this is something we tried to highlight in our presentation, that what counts as academic, what counts as administrative, who's responsible for what can be really ambiguous. And so our strategy at Concordia has been to collectively ask a lot of questions and like put them together and just keep asking questions. And I just really want to highlight something Peter said, which is what I also wanted to say, is the sort of shock doctrine thing. Something that we're seeing with budget cuts and austerity is also the centralization of power. So like, so I think that's something that we have to be aware of is budget issues causing the sort of slippage where senior admin take on more and more decision-making.
Okay, thank you for that question. We will go now to Norma.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for those informative presentations. I had a question about to our Concordia colleagues about your experiences, specifically about what tactics worked to push back, specifically about academic overreach, right? Because like many of these decisions that we're talking about are both financial and academic. And sort of what's happening is, right, that we're going to get told, oh, we're going to make decisions about budget cuts and restructuring now without actually having a meaningful consultation about what that actually means for our teaching, and in particular the quality of our teaching. And so I'm sort of curious. So this question has two parts. So I'm kind of curious to hear from our Concordia colleagues what kinds of tactics at sort of faculty board and senate have worked to push back against this kind of overreach. And then second, what kind of student mobilization has worked in your experience to push back against this?
Sure, I can jump in. I mean, I will say from our communications with Queens, you guys, I think, are quite far ahead of us in terms of mobilizing. So I don't know how much advice we have. But for us, at least for me as a chair in the Department of Arts and Sciences, we have been collectively mobilizing people at the unit head level, which is really useful because we're this sort of mediator between senior admin and, you know, the proletariat. And we're very blessed at Concordia to have a super engaged student body who are on strike. Many of them are on strike most of this week against the tuition hikes. And we're trying to build better and more constant lines of communication with the students to do exactly what Peter is suggesting.
Yeah, I'll just echo Anna to say that you know, one of our goals in participating in this is, in fact, to try to encourage as many community members at Concordia as possible to see what's going on at Queens, to learn from their model, to learn from their expertise, and to find different ways of mobilizing. You know, we there's stuff going on in Senate. There's you know, our faculty union. And of course the students mobilizing. There's a lot of irons in the fire, I would say, but not enough. You know, we're still just getting started. And while I'm on the floor, I actually I have to leave right now. I've got another meeting in 5 minutes, and so I just wanted to, before I did so, thank everyone for participating and for your questions. And of course, I'm available, Stephen Yeager at concordia.ca, if you'd like to reach out afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for answering that question. I have a bit of a follow-up to that. We have a question about whether or not there has been any success in terms of with any success with resistance or pushback, which I would assume is asking questions, writing statements, emails, etc., in terms of perhaps how the administration is engaging with faculty, students, and staff on this issue at Concordia. So has anything changed on that front?
Sure, I think these things move slowly, but yes, I think where we've been successful, and this comes to Dan's presentation, is actually just in demanding more information and getting that information. What we're working on now, and so like a lot of our sort of collective letters and stuff have been about demands for information. The communication we got at the beginning of the sort of budget deficit stuff was incredibly unclear and sometimes contradictory. And so we demanded a sit down with our provost and CFO, and we had that meeting and we asked them a lot of pointed questions, and we all came out, not satisfied by the situation, but certainly feeling like we actually just understood what was happening much better. What we're working on now, I think, is pushing to put the sort of collegiality and democracy back in these structures. And that's I think, a more long-term game.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Jacqueline next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for everyone speaking and being here and organizing. I have 3 sort of questions. The first is really just information, which I'm sure many people already know, but some perhaps not. As a senator, I attended over the weekend the board and Senate, used to be called a retreat, now they're calling it a conference. Mostly we got talked at again. Anyway, one valuable bit of information was that we are governed by Queens by a royal charter, which requires an act of parliament to change. So we have this sort of unusual kind of level of protection. I suspect it's protective since a lot of stuff is happening at the provincial level. So just to share that, I don't know all the ins and outs, but it's, I think, significant. The second issue has to do with more nuts and bolts thing that I'd love anybody's insight on. It seems to me to be sort of overreach that many staff members are currently effectively being seconded to work for NOWS, doing all this data collection for them, which makes them less available, especially people who are working at the departmental level, that people have to spend a lot of time producing data for NOWS, basically. And I'm wondering if there's anywhere we can push back on that. And the third question is specifically for Peter McInnis, the reference to Cheryl Foy, who I also heard about for the first time last weekend, recommended by, I think, the chair of the finance group on the board, saying how wonderful Clara Foy's work is and that we should all read her book. But specifically the claim that apparently that she's making, that there's some kind of conflict of interest with faculty, staff, and students in relation to the university. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what that conflict of interest exactly is supposed to be. So that's my questions, 2 cents.
Well, I can answer the Cheryl Foy question directly. Cheryl Foy is a lawyer, and she was working for a while with University or Ontario Institute of Technology, Ontario Tech in Oshawa. She's now a kind of free-forming consultant. I don't know if she even got along with the administrators, but we've heard that from people like Foy, McKinnon, and others, that somehow conducting our fiduciary duties is a conflict of interest, that we don't represent our members, but they're conflating a corporate board with a university and a college. There's a different governance structure, and as I said, it's been in place at Concordia since its inception, and Queens for a very long time as well, decades. And so, in fact, we're not, asking for information and raising issues at Senate or board. These are fundamental to our role. And in fact, we have intramural academic freedom to criticize our administrations, and we should use that freedom. And it's part of our professional responsibilities, not only as scholars, but also as citizens of the communities in which we exist. So Foy's understanding is hackneyed. She was presenting at an event in Vancouver several weeks ago, hosted by the Confederation of Universities of British Columbia, CUFA BC, and she gave these notions that academic unions are anti-democratic, or we all vote together, or we're antithetical. I mean, my experience, in the academic union movement for many years is that we solve more problems than we cause. You know, administrators often get themselves into a great deal of travail, and we offer the solution. So Foy is discredited, and the fact that she's recommended and happens is got to be challenged. And I just think, as much as I don't know if I want to go back on a board of governors, but I would have a go at that at the opportunity, because it's just really shallow, and she heads it out, especially before provincial and national associations. So ignore Ms. Foy.
Great, thank you very much. We will move on to Christopher, and for the next 3 people in line, Christopher, Mary, and Poya, that will bring us up to a bit past 1. So we will ask that questions are brief. So Christopher, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just had a question about consultants, and first of all, thanks to the organizers for putting this together. I think we're at a pretty critical time right now when I think we could see a lot of restructuring happening in different universities given the state of things. And I think consultants could be widely taken up across the university sector to engage in this kind of restructuring. And in this context, I'm wondering if anyone like the CAUT or Okupa is keeping track of where these consultations are happening and what kinds of advice they're providing. I think it's really important in this context to have a kind of resource that everyone can access. People in universities that might not have heard of NAUS or heard of Deloitte and know what kind of advice they're giving, to have a resource that they could access to see what kinds of advice they're providing to other universities and other jurisdictions. And I appreciate Queens Against Austerity. You guys have a part of your website dedicated to that. I find that's really helpful. And I'm wondering if we could kind of build from that as a way of just educating people and spreading awareness about the kinds of advice that are being provided. Thanks.
Well, I would say really briefly, and I don't want to dominate that, just that we do have resources on the CAT website. The governance committee is something that we struck about 5 years ago as an ad hoc committee, and I've sat on that since its inception. But it's a kind of we've seen a gradual degradation of collegial governance over some time, and the role of even who gets hired in these administrative positions is often cuts it out. So it's ironic that the Duff-Berdahl report all those years ago was suggesting more consultation. We're getting less. But in terms of the reports themselves, a lot of people, as I said, don't read them, and they should be read, because as academics, we're good at peer review, and these things don't stand up for much peer review. They're really, and as the co-representation earlier this week would say, they're really thin, and we need to call them out, because if we don't, it's a case that the emperor has no clothes. They have more gravitas than they deserve. So that's on us to do that.
Well, thank you. We'll move on to Mary.
Okay, thanks to everybody for organizing this. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sela Olmsted, the CUFA president. I would maybe just add a comment to the question Jackie had, or the comment she had about having seconded some of the people from our individual units to work on NAUS. From what I understand, these are all department managers who are the one group that are non-unionized at Queen's. They're being the ones that are pulled in. From what I understand. But I was going to make a comment and see if anybody, including Peter, had something to say about this. So as we're going through seeing these decisions that will end up usually at Senate, but sometimes a board of trustees, and there's a process that they get there, and we kind of hear about things that are maybe being changed and maybe coming to faculty board. And so as somebody that's trying to keep track of these and hold our administrators accountable to collegial governance, I often go and meet with deans or associate deans and talk to them and say, how is this happening that we're not hearing about it? And 95% of the time they say, oh, we communicate that. We've been giving information either to the associate heads or to the heads and we have such a decentralized structure that it's hard to even keep track of where the communication goes. And so their response is, oh, you're just not paying attention, or your community is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, following these through. And I can't help but think that this is some kind of strategy to actually disrupt the collegial governance process, because when something finally arrives, for example, at Senate, and I run a Senate faculty caucus, and many of the people on this call come, and our Senate agendas, which include the consent agenda, can be more than 100 pages long. So I just wonder, for example, if anyone at Concordia has a similar experience, anybody has comments to make, if Peter has some suggestions from other faculty associations about how we could try to counter that.
Yeah, I don't know how you solve that problem, but we have definitely had the same experience of being told, yeah, we already sent you that information or whatever, and either it's buried or it wasn't, or something that I find now that we're in more and more communication with our students, that they especially are not getting some like information that's really not that sensitive that they are totally should be getting.
Right.
And I just wanted to comment about one more thing, which is this thing of people being seconded and all of that. When we had this meeting that we demanded with the provost, she kind of said, well, you know, I'm always wary of asking you guys to do more and get more involved because you always say you're overworked. And I think to my mind, one of the challenges of like getting more involved in collegial governance is is us doing less of the stupid stuff. I can't find a professional way to say that. But we're often being asked to do administrative tasks that are either useless or redundant or needlessly bureaucratic. And I think the barrier to people getting involved in like the meaningful stuff is indeed that we are overworked but we do actually really, really want to be involved in decision making.
Well, I think I try to make that point, say I spend a lot of my time trying to chase communications, and that a few months ago, I set up something on our executive where one individual from each of our faculties forwards to one of our staff members a centralized communication message. So we can see how quickly things filter down and where there's stoppage of communication. Sometimes we have a single piece of information that comes from, for example, the principal's office, and the differential of it getting to our members can be as much as 6 days, depending on how many steps it has to go through, which I don't find fair. So I think it's not, you know, I agree with you, it's not having people get more involved, it's finding a way to get rid of the things that are meaningless involvement.
I would just briefly add that there's a number of tactics that have been applied at universities across the country. One of things coming out of the pandemic is conducting online meetings, which allows administrators to run the board, limits participation. They may read chats. This is really antithetical to, I mean, people talk about accessibility, but it's antithetical to democratic process. I would insist on in-person or hybrid meetings at the very least. Also, the dumping of information the last minute before meetings is another technique. The apportioning out of reading material, not just one or two people, is a way of getting through this. People with, again, more to Dan's presentation and more financial literacy, you can whip through the financial budgets more effectively and address the issues. But also the importance, I think, of just engaging as to the point about Anderson Waking about Concordia. We have you know, a fiduciary responsibility to be informed and to make informed decisions, not just decisions that are running out the clock. And so if you actually go to meetings and they're held in person or even online, often you'll have deans or AVPs or, you know, somebody, and they talk, but it's just filling. It's almost like a filibuster. They don't want to take questions. I think you have to have a structured Q&A and expectations and have people prepared to ask those questions. Don't just improvise it. I mean, you can improvise a little bit at the meeting, but you better be prepared to ask your question, or that a moment will pass. It is, you know, we are familiar with this when it happens to us. but we get played a lot each and every time. So if we're aware of this beforehand, we're better able to counteract it.
Great, thank you very much for those. We will be wrapping up now because of the time, but I just want to thank all of the speakers, attendees, and everyone who asked questions, helped ask them, and engaged with the chat. There are a couple links that I'm going to put into the chat right now. If anyone has any additional questions that they would like to be put in touch with QCAA, the Queen's Coalition Against Austerity, you can email contact@qcaa.ca. I just put that in the chat. There's also a student group at Queen's called Students versus Cuts. They also have a Gmail. So this is the Gmail for that. If you have any students who'd like to get in touch from Concordia with students at Queen's. As well, QCAA has a newsletter. So any of the questions that are sent in through the email can be addressed and circulated for community consideration in that. So you can sign up at www.qcaa.ca for that newsletter. And as well, the student group here also has an Instagram. So if you have students or you yourself would like to follow along with that group, it's Queen's U Students versus Cuts on Instagram. So we'll continue to keep in touch with each other. I think this was very beneficial. So thanks everyone for organizing it. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the speakers, and thanks so much to Claire, who did a great job moderating for us and organizing and everything else. Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you on Zoom.